My name is Brandon Kessler. I'm 32. And last year, my wife Amanda and I bought our first house, a 2-story colonial, on Cedar Hollow Road, just outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was a good deal, built in the 1960s, previously owned by an elderly couple who'd moved into assisted living. The inspection came back clean, except for some minor electrical updates needed in the basement. We moved in on a Saturday in September. Spent the first week unpacking boxes, hanging curtains, getting used to the creaks every old house has. Amanda joked that the place had good bones. I agreed. About 2 weeks in, I started noticing the thermostat would reset itself overnight, not broken, just switched from our setting back to 68 degrees. Exactly the temperature the inspection report mentioned the previous owners kept the house at. I chalked it up to a glitch in the smart thermostat we'd installed and reset it each morning without much thought. Then came the smell. Every few days, usually in the evening, a faint smell of pipe tobacco would drift through the upstairs hallway for a minute or two, then vanish completely. Neither Amanda nor I smoke, and none of our neighbors did either. I checked, casually over a fence conversation with the guy next door. He just said, "Old Mr. Doyle used to sit on the porch with his pipe most evenings." Nice guy. I hadn't mentioned the smell to him at all. I told myself old houses hold on to smells in the walls, in the wood. That maybe it was residual from decades of habit, finally working its way out through the vents as the heating system ran. It made enough sense that I didn't lose sleep over it. The real turning point came in November. Amanda was out of town visiting her sister, and I was alone in the house for the first time. Around 10 p.m., sitting in the living room, I heard someone walking upstairs, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from what I knew was the direction of the spare bedroom toward the top of the stairs. I froze, listened, told myself it was the house settling with the temperature drop outside. The footsteps stopped at the top of the staircase. Then, clearly, unmistakably, I heard someone exhale, a long, tired sigh, the kind an older person makes sitting down after a long day. I didn't go up. I sat in the living room with every light on until almost 2 a.m., telling myself it was pipes, wind, an old structure adjusting to the cold snap. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, everything upstairs was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing moved, nothing disturbed. Just a faint, familiar smell of pipe tobacco lingering in the hallway, gone by the time I got out of the shower. When Amanda got home, I mentioned the tobacco smell, framing it lightly, not the footsteps. She said something that stopped me. She'd smelled it too, the very first week we moved in, but assumed it was coming from outside and never brought it up because it seemed too small a thing to mention. We looked up the house's history out of curiosity more than concern. County records showed the Doyles had owned the house for almost 40 years. Mr. Doyle had passed away in the house itself, in the upstairs bedroom, 3 years before we bought it. Natural causes, nothing suspicious, according to the obituary I found in the local paper's online archive. His wife had moved to assisted living shortly after, unable to stay in the house alone. We still live there. The thermostat still resets itself sometimes, though less often now. The tobacco smell comes and goes usually in the evenings, usually for just a minute or two. We've stopped mentioning it to each other most of the time. Not because we've explained it away, but because some nights sitting downstairs after dark, it feels less like something to be afraid of and more like something that simply hasn't finished leaving yet.
My name is Sabrina Alcott. I'm 30, and 2 years ago my fiancé Marcus and I bought a raised cottage-style house on Pereire Street in New Orleans in the uptown area, close enough to walk to Magazine Street. It was older, built sometime in the 1890s according to the listing, recently renovated by a flipper before we bought it. Fresh paint, refinished floors, updated kitchen, everything looked clean and modern under the surface of an old house. The realtor mentioned briefly that the house had some history, like most houses down here, said with a little laugh. The kind of comment you brush off in a city where every other building claims to be haunted for tourism's sake. We moved in that August. Adjusting to New Orleans heat, the particular creak of raised foundations, the sound of the streetcar a few blocks over. The first few weeks were unremarkable unpacking, meeting neighbors, getting used to a house that groaned and settled with every temperature swing typical of the Gulf Coast humidity. The first odd thing was small enough that I almost forgot about it. In the back bedroom we'd set up as a home office, the ceiling fan would occasionally switch on by itself, always on the lowest setting, always in the early afternoon. Marcus checked the wiring, found nothing wrong, chalked it up to some kind of remote interference apparently common with older ceiling fan systems and other households' garage door openers or smart devices nearby. Then came the smell, sweet, floral, unmistakably like gardenias, drifting through that same back room every few days. Strongest in the late afternoon, gone within minutes. Neither of us had any gardenia plants, and our small backyard held nothing but a struggling banana tree and some overgrown ferns. I mentioned it to a neighbor, an older woman named Miss Doucette who lived on the block for decades. She went quiet for a moment, then said only that the Guillory girl loved gardenias, before changing the subject entirely. Not offering anything more no matter how I tried to follow up. I didn't push it at the time. New Orleans is full of old stories, half of them exaggerated, half of them forgotten details dressed up for effect. I told myself it was nothing. By October, the fan switching on had become a near daily occurrence. Always the back bedroom, always low setting, sometimes accompanied by that same gardenia smell, sometimes not. Marcus, initially dismissive, started noticing it too, enough that he stopped working in that room in the afternoons without really discussing why. The unease deepened one evening in November. I was home alone, sitting in the back room finishing some work, when the fan clicked on as usual. This time, beneath the hum of the blades, I heard something like humming a woman's voice. Soft, wordless, almost like a lullaby fragment, coming from somewhere close, though the room was empty except for me. I sat frozen for what felt like a full minute before the humming faded along with the gardenia smell, the fan slowing to a stop shortly after. I didn't tell Marcus that night. I told myself I was tired, that stress from work was playing tricks on me, that any sound could be explained by pipes, wind through old window frames, a neighbor's radio carrying oddly through humid air, curious despite myself. I spent an evening researching the house's history through the local library's digital newspaper archive. It took a while, but I found a short article from 1962 mentioning a young woman named Elise Guillory who had lived in a house on that block, described only as having passed unexpectedly at just 22 years old. The article was frustratingly vague, giving no cause, no further context. Just a small notice and a funeral announcement listing gardenias specifically as the family's requested flowers in lieu of donations. I mentioned what I'd found to Miss Doucette again, more directly this time, asking what she remembered about the Guillory family. She hesitated longer than before, then said only that Elise had died in that house, in that same back room, and that the family moved out within the year, unable to stay. She wouldn't say how Elise had died, no matter how gently I asked. only repeating that some things weren't meant to be dug up again, especially not by people still settling into a house. The humming returned twice more that December, always in the same room, always with the fan and the gardenia scent, though never longer than a minute or two. Each time, I stood still and listened rather than fleeing, some strange mixture of fear and reluctant tenderness keeping me rooted in place, unable to fully explain either reaction to myself. The last time it happened was in early January. Marcus was home this time, and we both heard it together, the humming slightly clearer than before, almost forming words I couldn't quite catch except for what sounded like a single repeated phrase, something like "still here," though neither of us could be certain that's what we'd actually heard versus what our minds constructed from fragments of sound in a stressed, half-panicked moment. We had an electrician friend check the fan's wiring more thoroughly after that, just to rule out anything explainable. He found nothing wrong, no loose connections, no interference sources nearby, and seemed genuinely puzzled by our description of it switching on with no clear trigger. We still live in the house. The fan still turns on occasionally, though less often now, maybe once every few weeks instead of daily. The gardenia smell comes less frequently too. We've stopped trying to explain it to each other, mostly because neither of us wants to be the one who suggests moving, and because some quiet, unspoken part of both of us has started treating those afternoons in the back room less like something to fear and more like a presence we've simply learned to share the house with, whether we fully understand it or not. My name is Rachel Kinsey. I'm 33, and last October my husband Paul and I bought a house on Ashford Hollow Road in rural Vermont, about 20 minutes outside Montpelier. It was a foreclosure, priced well under market, sitting empty for almost 2 years before we found the listing. Our realtor mentioned the previous family had moved out suddenly for personal reasons and left it at that. We didn't ask further. We were just happy to afford 4 bedrooms and 2 acres of land on our budget. The house itself was a farmhouse built in the 1920s, renovated somewhat in the 90s, with a detached barn we planned to eventually convert into a studio for Paul's woodworking. The inspection came back mostly clean, some knob and tube wiring still in the walls. A section of the basement foundation that needed sealing. Nothing alarming for a house that age. We moved in the first week of October, and for the first few weeks, everything felt like a normal transition into an old house, cold spots near drafty windows, a furnace that clanked when it kicked on, the particular quiet of living somewhere without close neighbors. Paul joked that the silence out there took getting used to, no traffic sounds, no city hum, just wind through the tree line at night. The first strange thing I noticed was small. In the upstairs hallway, there was a section of wall with slightly different paint, a rectangle, roughly door-sized, painted over but still faintly visible under certain lighting, as if a doorway had once been there and later sealed shut with drywall. I mentioned it to Paul, who shrugged and guessed it was probably an old closet, closed off during a past renovation. Reasonable enough. Around the 3rd week, I started noticing the temperature in that particular stretch of hallway dropped noticeably lower than the rest of the house, even with the heating running steadily. I chalked it up to poor insulation near an exterior wall, common enough in houses that old, and didn't think much more of it. Then came the sound. Late one night in early November, I woke to a faint scratching noise coming from inside that same section of wall, rhythmic, slow, like fingernails dragging lightly across drywall from the other side. I woke Paul, and we both lay there listening. He suggested mice in the wall cavity, maybe raccoons in the attic space above, something that made sense for an old farmhouse in rural Vermont. As the weather turned cold and animals sought shelter, we called an exterminator the following week. He checked the attic, the walls, found no droppings, no nesting material, no entry points consistent with rodents or raccoons, nothing that would explain the sound, though he agreed something had clearly been audible based on how specifically we described it. He suggested it might be settling pipes, something structural, and left without much more explanation. The scratching continued intermittently through November, always at night, always from that same stretch of wall. I started sleeping poorly, lying awake listening for it, sometimes hearing nothing for days and then, without warning, the sound returning just as I'd start convincing myself it had stopped for good. In late November. Curious and increasingly unsettled, I drove into Montpelier and looked up the property's history at the county records office. The house had changed ownership 4 times since 1974, unusually frequent for a rural property that size. Digging further through local newspaper archives, I found a short article from 1974 mentioning a house fire on Ashford Hollow Road that had damaged an upstairs bedroom. Though the article gave no further details about injuries, causes, or what became of the family living there at the time, the article was oddly brief for something serious enough to make the local paper at all. As if something in the reporting had been deliberately left thin, I mentioned what I'd found to a woman working the desk at the Historical Society, an older local named Mrs. Halloway. Her expression shifted slightly when I said the address, and she asked if I was the one living there now. When I said yes, she paused for a long moment before saying only that some things that happened out that way in the 70s weren't the kind people liked discussed, especially not with new owners, and that most families who bought that house eventually moved on faster than expected. She wouldn't elaborate further, no matter how directly I asked, and grew visibly uncomfortable enough that I didn't push. The scratching escalated the first week of December. It grew louder, more insistent, no longer confined to just the wall but seeming to move along its length, following me if I walked the hallway at night, stopping whenever I stopped, resuming whenever I continued walking. Paul heard it too by then, unable to explain it away as easily as he had at first. The night everything changed was December 9th. Paul was working a late shift, and I was home alone. Around AM, the scratching started, louder than ever, directly behind that painted-over section of wall. Then, for the first time, it stopped abruptly, replaced by 3 deliberate, heavy knocks from inside the wall itself, evenly spaced, unmistakably intentional. Nothing like scratching or settling or animals. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at that faint rectangular outline in the paint, my entire body flooded with a cold, primal fear I couldn't rationalize away no matter how hard I tried. Then, barely audible, almost beneath the range of hearing, I heard what sounded like a child's voice, muffled through drywall and lath, saying something I couldn't fully make out except for one word, repeated twice, that I was almost certain was please. I didn't investigate the wall. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat on the stairs until Paul got home at AM, and I told him everything, my voice shaking in a way it hadn't since I was a child myself. We hired a contractor in January to open that section of wall, telling him only that we suspected water damage. Behind the drywall, he found the remains of an old sealed-off doorway just as I'd suspected, leading to a narrow, closet-sized space that had clearly once connected to the adjacent bedroom before being fully drywalled over on both sides at some point in the house's past. The space was entirely empty, no furniture, no debris, nothing structurally unusual, just bare original plaster walls with faint, dark discoloration in the corners that the contractor said was likely old smoke damage. Consistent with a fire, he found nothing else. No remains, no hidden objects, nothing to explain the sounds, the voice, the cold, or the 3 sharp knocks. I still can't fully convince myself I imagined. We had the space properly insulated and drywalled again, this time without sealing it into a hidden room, opening it instead into the hallway itself for storage. The scratching hasn't returned since, neither has the knocking, but some nights, walking that stretch of hallway alone, I still feel that same drop in temperature, fainter now, barely perceptible, and I find myself unable to walk past that spot without pausing, waiting, listening for something I both hope and dread might still be there. unable to shake the feeling that we sealed something back into silence rather than actually resolving whatever it was we'd found.